August Dunlap had not spoken a tender word to another living soul in 20 years, and the land itself had become the only language he trusted. The Dunlap Ranch sat on 460 acres of high Wyoming grassland, west of Cheyenne, where the Laramie Mountains pushed their dark shoulders up against a sky so wide and blue it made a man feel small in the best possible way. August had built every fence post himself, had driven every nail into every plank of the barn with his own calloused hands, had watched the first herd of longhorns arrive in the spring of 1869 as a young man of 22, and had not looked back since. He was 42 now in the summer of 1889, and the ranch was the fullest thing in his life. It fed him, occupied him, gave him reason to rise before dawn and reason to fall into his bunk at night without the creeping sense of waste. The cattle grazed in the lower pasture. The horses were 16 strong and fine-tempered. The bunkhouse held 3 hired hands: Clem Purdy, a wiry older man who could rope anything that moved, and the Valdez brothers, Hector and Marco, who had ridden up from New Mexico 2 summers ago and proved themselves indispensable within the first week. August had no wife. He had once briefly believed that a woman named Clara Fenwick might become one, but she had taken one look at the Wyoming winters and chosen to return to St. Louis in 1873, and after that August had decided that the ranch asked enough of a man without adding the complication of a heart that could leave. So he had not tried again. He wore his solitude the way he wore his boots, broken in, comfortable, chosen. What no one had warned him about was a widow named Louisa Langston. She arrived on a Tuesday in early June, which was the kind of information August only knew because Clem had ridden to Cheyenne for supplies and come back with the news that a woman had taken the Heller cabin at the eastern edge of August's property. The Heller cabin was not technically on August's land. It sat on a narrow strip of deeded ground that old Matthias Heller had carved out before he died in '85, leaving the property to a distant niece who had never once set foot in Wyoming. The niece, apparently, had finally sold it, and the buyer was a widow out of Kansas. "She's got a wagon full of furniture and 2 mules," Clem reported over supper, tearing a piece of cornbread in half with the ease of a man delivering ordinary news. Hector helped her get the bigger pieces inside, said she was polite about it. "That's her business," August said, and he meant it. But the Heller cabin sat close enough to the eastern fence line that, 2 mornings later, when August rode out to check the wire that had been showing where near the creek crossing, he saw her. Louisa Langston was standing in the tall grass 50 yards from her door with her arms crossed and her face turned up toward the mountains, and even from a distance August could see that she was not simply looking at them. She was studying them, the way a person does when they are trying to decide whether a place can hold them or whether they will be the ones who break first. She wore a plain blue dress that had seen better days and a wide-brimmed straw hat that was doing its best against the Wyoming sun. Her hair was dark and pinned back, though several strands had escaped in the morning wind. She looked to be somewhere in her middle 30s, sturdy in the way that people who had worked for everything they owned tend to be sturdy. August had intended to ride past. He had intended to check the wire and return to the upper pasture where 3 heifers were showing signs of going lame. He had intended a great many things that morning, and none of them included pulling his horse to a stop and touching the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. She turned, and she was not startled in the way that women sometimes were when a large man on a large horse appeared without warning. She simply looked at him with steady brown eyes and said, "Good morning. August Dunlap. I run the Dunlap Ranch. Your land borders mine on the west." "Louisa Langston," she said. "I suppose we are neighbors then." "Suppose so." He looked at the cabin behind her, at the new boards she had already nailed across the porch railing where Matthias Heller's old wood had rotted through. "You do that yourself." "I did," she said, without pride and without apology. "It'll hold," he said, which was the highest compliment August Dunlap generally gave to anything. She nodded once, and he touched his hat again and rode on and told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. By the following Monday, Louisa Langston had come to the ranch house door with a jar of pickled beets and a straightforward expression. August had been sitting on the porch cleaning a rifle, and he looked up at her arrival with the particular blankness of a man who had not been expecting company in years. "You helped me more than you know by not making a scene about the property line," she said, holding out the jar. "Hector told me the Heller parcel used to cause problems. I want you to know I have no designs on your water rights." August set down the rifle and took the jar. "I wasn't worried about it." "Good," she said. "Neither was I, but I thought we should say so out loud." He studied her for a moment. She was not performing. That was the thing about her that unsettled him even in those first minutes of real conversation. She was not performing anything. She said what she meant, and she stood in her own skin without apology. And August, who had built his life around simplicity and directness, found that he had no proper defense against it. "You want coffee?" he asked, because it was the only hospitable thing he knew how to offer. "I wouldn't say no," she said. They sat on the porch and drank coffee that was stronger than was polite, and Louisa did not complain about the strength. She told him she was from Abilene originally, that she had married a man named Thomas Langston who had died of a fever 3 years ago, that she had tried staying in Kansas, but had found it impossible to remain in a place that was built entirely of other people's memories of her husband. She had heard that Wyoming had land still available at a fair price, and she had come to see for herself. "It's harder than it looks," August said. "Most honest things are," she replied. He filled her cup again without asking, and she held it in both hands, and the morning went on longer than August had planned for. And later, when Clem found him still on the porch past 9 o'clock with a cold rifle and an empty coffee pot, the old man said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. The summer of 1889 was a dry one, and August was occupied with it the way every rancher in that part of Wyoming was occupied moving cattle to where the grass still held, watching the creek levels, making decisions about which animals to sell before the ground gave up entirely. He did not have time to think about Louisa Langston, or so he told himself, and for the first 2 weeks it was even partially true. Then her mule went lame. She appeared at the ranch gate on a Wednesday evening, walking, which meant she had come 2 miles on foot rather than ask for help, and that told August a great deal about her. He was in the yard with Hector when she came through the gate, and before she could say more than his name he had already pulled on his coat. "Which one?" he asked. "The gray," she said. "Her left foreleg. She was fine this morning. Probably a stone bruise. Let me look." He walked back with her in the long evening light, through the tall grass that was already beginning to turn gold too early from the drought, and Hector followed because Hector was useful with animals and knew it. The gray mule stood in her small pen with her weight shifted and her ears low, and August crouched and ran his hand down the leg with the practiced patience of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "Stone bruise," he confirmed. "She'll be all right in a week. Keep her off the ground as much as you can, and this." He pulled a small tin of salve from his coat pocket, the kind he always carried because the ranch required it. "Twice a day." Louisa took the tin. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said, and he said it the way men in that country said it when they meant it completely. She looked at him with those steady eyes of hers and said, "Then I'll make supper and you'll eat it." It was not a question, and August, who had not eaten a meal made by another person in longer than he cared to calculate, found himself saying, "All right." The cabin was small, but she had made it her own in the weeks since arriving. There were curtains on the windows, cut from flour sacks and dyed a pale yellow that made the evening light warm and particular. There were books on a shelf she had built from 2 planks and 4 stones, more books than August had seen in one room outside of the small lending library in Cheyenne. There was a cast-iron stove that she had already broken in, and it filled the cabin with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread that hit August somewhere behind his sternum in a way that was wholly unexpected. He stood in her doorway like a man who had forgotten the protocols of being inside, and she moved past him without comment and ladled 2 bowls without ceremony. They ate at the small table she had dragged in from the wagon, and she asked him about the ranch, not the polite questions people asked, not how many acres or how many head, but specific questions, like whether the drought was affecting the eastern pasture differently than the western, and whether he had considered leasing the lower grazing rights to the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Association the way some of the smaller operations had done. "You know ranching," he said. "I grew up on one," she said. "My father ran 300 head in Kansas until the drought of '78 broke him. I know what the land looks like when it's giving up and when it's resting. Which does mine look like?" She considered it seriously, in the way that told him she had already been looking at his land with that kind of attention. "Resting," she said, "but it's tired." He ate in silence for a moment and then said, "Yes," because it was the truest word for it. After supper she made more coffee and they sat outside her door where the evening had turned purple and the first stars were arriving, and August stayed longer than he had meant to, and when he finally rose to leave he stood in the dark for a moment and said, "Thank you for supper." "Thank you for the mule," she said. He walked back to the ranch in the dark and stood in the yard for a while before going inside, looking at the house he had built room by room over 20 years, and it seemed to him that it sounded different than it usually did. Not worse, just different, like a word he had been pronouncing correctly that someone had just told him had another meaning entirely. July came hot and relentless, and with it came trouble in the form of a man named Doyle Breckett, who ran a large operation north of Cheyenne and had been quietly acquiring grazing rights across the county by methods that ranged from legal to considerably less so. August had heard his name for years without it touching him directly, but in the first week of July, Breckett's foreman, a flat-faced man named Sid Greer, rode onto the Dunlap ranch and made August an offer to lease the southern pasture. "Mr. Breckett's prepared to be generous," Greer said, sitting his horse with the air of a man who expected to be thanked. "Tell Mr. Breckett the southern pasture isn't for lease," August said. "He might make it worth your while to reconsider." "He might," August agreed pleasantly, "but he won't." Greer rode away, and August told himself it was finished, but Clem, who had been ranching in Wyoming since before August was born, shook his head slowly over his coffee that night and said, "Breckett doesn't take no for an answer. He gets it said to him too often these days, being as how most of the small holders have already sold, and it makes him mean." "I've dealt with mean before," August said. "Not like Breckett," Clem said, and left it at that. It was Louisa who brought Breckett back into focus, in a way August had not expected. She had ridden into Cheyenne on her recovered mule to visit the land office on some business of her own, and when she returned she came directly to the ranch, something she had not done before, and her expression had the particular quality of contained alarm. "Doyle Breckett is contesting the Heller deed," she said, standing in the yard while August was helping Marco reshoe one of the draft horses. "His man at the land office is claiming the original deed had a defect in the description and that the parcel reverts to a larger tract Breckett bought 2 years ago." August straightened up from the horse's hoof and looked at her. "That's not a legal claim. Heller's deed was recorded in '72 and it's been clear since." "I know that," she said, "but the land office clerk was very deferential to Breckett's lawyer, and I got the distinct impression that the deferential part wasn't purely professional." August understood exactly what she was saying. He put down the horseshoe rasp and wiped his hands on his trousers. "We need to ride to Cheyenne tomorrow," he said. "I know the county recorder. He's an honest man." "I'd appreciate that," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not the gratitude itself but the steadiness of it, the refusal to let the alarm become panic, that August found himself thinking about long after she had ridden back to her cabin. They rode to Cheyenne together on Thursday, August on his black gelding and Louisa on the recovered gray mule, which she rode with the easy confidence of someone who had been on animals all her life. The county recorder was a man named Amos Trent, who had held the office for 15 years and was not, as August had stated, the kind of man who could be purchased cheaply or otherwise. Trent reviewed the Heller deed and Brackett's counterclaim in the same afternoon and declared the counterclaim without merit. Brackett's lawyer, a thin man from Denver who smelled of cologne that was not appropriate for Wyoming, argued that the original survey description used an obsolete benchmark that had since been moved. "The benchmark is a granite outcrop," Amos Trent said, with the patience of a man who had been hearing nonsense for 15 years, "and granite outcrops do not move. Mrs. Langston's title is sound." They rode back to the ranch in the long afternoon light, side by side on the open road, and August noticed that Louisa did not immediately fill the silence with talk. She let the land and the sky exist around them without requiring it to be annotated, and August, who had always found that particular quality rare in anyone, rode beside her and felt something that was unfamiliar and not unwelcome. It was a little like the feeling of finding a fence line that had held through a hard winter simple satisfaction, and something under it that was warmer than simple. "Brackett won't let it go," she said, as the ranch gate came into sight. "No," August agreed. "He won't, but the law's on your side now, and I'll make sure he knows you're not alone out here." She glanced at him, a quick sidelong look that he caught at the edge of his vision. "You do that." "I'm doing it," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thank you, August," and it was the first time she had used his name without the small formality that had lingered between them since the beginning, and he felt it the way you feel a change in the wind, suddenly and entirely. August's ranch hand Marco Valdez was 26 and romantic by nature, and he began making observations about Louisa Langston at supper in early August that August shut down with a single look. But Marco had the resilience of the young and returned to the subject sideways, through comments about how the eastern fence line had never been checked so regularly until recent weeks, or about how the ranch house seemed to smell better on the days that Mrs. Langston stopped by. "You're going to find yourself checking fence in the north pasture alone for a month," August said. Marco grinned and said nothing further, but Hector caught August's eye across the table with an expression of quiet amusement that was somehow harder to dismiss because it was less combative. Clem Purdy said nothing. Clem had known August for 16 years and had watched him with the patient knowledge of an old man who understands that the things a person resists most persistently are the things that will change them most completely. August began, in small ways, adjusting. He found himself noting when the eastern fence needed checking before it actually did. He found himself on mornings when Louisa would appear at the gate with some small business, a question about where to source hay, a borrowed tool, a report on something she had seen at the creek, that those mornings had a quality the others did not. Not urgency, not need. Just the particular satisfaction of a day that begins with something good in it. He brought her a crate of firewood without being asked, in the second week of August, because he had noticed that her woodpile was getting low and the summer nights in Wyoming could turn sharp without warning. She accepted it without the elaborate gratitude that would have made him uncomfortable, and instead offered him a cup of coffee and the information that she had found a good spring on the southern edge of her parcel that was still running even in the drought. "You should know about it," she said. "Your eastern cattle could reach it if you moved the fence 40 yards. He blinked at her. "You'd let me move the fence onto your land." 40 yards, she said. "I'm not using that corner. The cattle need water. These aren't complicated calculations." "Most people would call that land," August said. "Most people haven't watched cattle die in a drought," she replied, and she said it without drama from memory, and he understood that she had seen it and that it had mattered to her in the way that real losses matter. He moved the fence the following week, with Hector's help, and the cattle found the spring by the end of the day with the instinctive certainty of animals who know where the water is. On the day the fence was finished, August stood at the new line and looked east toward Louisa's cabin and saw her on her porch in the evening light with a book open in her lap, and he felt something shift in his chest with the slow deliberation of a door that has long been closed swinging open, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the honest patience of things that have been a long time coming. He did not go to her that evening. He was not yet sure he knew what to do with what he was feeling, and August Dunlap had always been a man who preferred to understand a thing before he committed to it. But he thought about her on the ride back to the ranch house, and he thought about her over supper, and he lay in his bunk that night looking at the ceiling and thought that 20 years was a long time to be good at being alone, and wondered if good at something and right about something were always the same. In September, Doyle Beckett made his second move. It was not legal this time. Or rather, it occupied that space between legal and illegal that men like Beckett had made an art form: pressure without proof, fear without fingerprints. 3 of Louisa's fence posts along the western edge of her property were found cut and pushed over in a single night, which might have been cattle, except that the cuts were clean and nothing had come through. 2 days later, her barn door was found hanging off its hinges in the morning when she had latched it securely the night before. She came to August at 7 in the morning on the second occasion, and she was angry. Not frightened, angry. Her eyes were bright with it, and her jaw was set with the particular tension of a woman who has been pushed and has decided not to move. "Beckett," August said before she finished explaining. "I have no proof," she said. "No," he agreed. But Sid Greer was seen in Milner's saloon last night telling anyone who'd listen that the Heller parcel would be available for sale soon. That's close enough to evidence for a conversation. "I don't want a conversation," she said, and her voice was controlled but absolutely clear. "I want him to understand that I am not going anywhere." August looked at her, at the determination in her face, the practical anger that had no self-pity in it, and something very simple and very final settled in him. He said, "Then let's make sure he understands it." He rode to Cheyenne that afternoon with Clem and Hector, and he had a conversation with the county sheriff, a man named Walt Hobbs who was honest and thorough, and had already had his own trouble with Beckett's methods. Hobbs agreed to make a visible appearance at the Heller parcel on a regular basis for the following weeks, and to have a pointed discussion with Sid Greer about the definition of property crime under Wyoming territorial law. It was enough. Beckett was not a man who backed down from principle, but he was a man who calculated risk, and the calculation of Dunlap, who had 400 acres and a reputation, standing clearly beside a widow with a legal deed and a sheriff paying attention, did not resolve in his favor. The fence cutting stopped. The harassment stopped. Beckett moved his attention to a smaller, more isolated operation 30 miles north, and August heard about it without satisfaction and without surprise. What surprised him, or rather, what he continued to refuse to call surprise because it had been building too slowly to claim suddenness, was the evening that followed, when he rode back to the ranch and saw Louisa's lamp still lit in her window at 10 o'clock at night, and instead of riding past he stopped his horse and sat in the dark for a long time. She was still awake, which meant she was still worried, and August was not a man who could ride past someone he cared about who was still awake and worried. He tied his horse at her fence post and knocked on the door. She opened it quickly, which meant she had heard him coming, and she looked at him in the lamplight with an expression he did not quite know how to read. She was still dressed, still had her hair pinned, though the day had been long. "Is it handled?" she asked. "For now," he said. "He won't come back to bother you. Hobbs is watching and Beckett knows it." She exhaled a long, slow release of something she had been carrying tight, and her shoulders dropped a fraction. "Good," she said. "That's good." She opened the door wider and he went in, and she put water on for coffee with the ease of habit, and he sat at the small table and looked at her moving around the cabin with a warmth in his chest that he was no longer pretending was anything other than what it was. "You didn't have to fight my battles," she said, turning from the stove. "No," he agreed, "but I wanted to." She stilled at that. The word wanted had weight in it that they both heard, and for a moment the cabin was very quiet. "August," she said slowly, "what are we doing?" It was the bravest question he had heard in 20 years. He looked at her across the small table in the lamplight, at the woman who had arrived on his fence line with a jar of pickled beets and an absence of performance, who had given 40 yards of her land to his cattle without arithmetic, who had stood against Doyle Beckett with anger instead of fear, who had made his mornings different in a way he had not asked for and could not now undo. "I don't know that I'm any good at explaining it," he said, "but I know I've been finding reasons to come this direction more often than the ranch requires, and I know the days you don't come to the gate are slower than the ones you do." She sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table and looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "I lost Thomas 3 years ago," she said. "I wasn't sure I would ever want to sit in a room with a man again without feeling like I was wearing someone else's life, but I don't feel that way when I'm with you." "What do you feel?" he asked, and the question cost him something, which was how he knew it was honest. "Like I'm exactly where I am," she said. "Not somewhere I used to be. Not somewhere I'm supposed to be, just here." August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's about the best thing anyone has ever told me." She smiled at him, not the polite smile, not the social smile, but a real one that reached her eyes and changed her face entirely. And August felt it like the first rain after a long drought, sudden and complete and more welcome than he had realized he had been waiting for. He did not reach across the table that night. He was not a man who moved without being sure, and he was not sure yet. Or rather, he was sure of his own feeling but less sure of all the terrain between feeling and saying and doing. He rode home in the dark with his heart working differently than it usually did, and when Clem looked up from the bunkhouse door at the sound of the horse coming in, August said nothing and Clem asked nothing, but the old man's eyes held something quiet and knowing. October turned the high Wyoming grass to gold and amber, and the cattle settled into the lower pasture where the grass held better and the creek still ran from Louisa's spring. The ranch work of fall was relentless and necessary mending, storing, preparing, and August threw himself into it with the full intensity he had always given to the land. But something was different now. The work was still everything it had been. But it was not everything. He had always organized his days around what the ranch needed. He had always woken and looked at the land first and thought about what it required. He had always settled his hours around fence and cattle and water and weather. And he still did all of those things, but now, underneath the structure of the day, there was a different pulse. There was a consciousness of the direction east, where a lamp burned in a small window, and a woman was building something of her own with the same careful determination that he recognized in himself. He began to bring her things that were useful, a better lamp oil than she had been using, a spare set of leather gloves when he noticed her hands were chapping in the October wind, a young dog, a cattle dog pup from Clem's neighbor's litter because she had mentioned once in passing that the cabin felt quiet in a way that was different from peaceful. She named the dog Biscuit, which made August laugh, an actual out-loud laugh that startled both of them. "What?" she said with the small defensive smile of someone who knows they are being gently teased. "Nothing," he said. "It suits him." "It does," she agreed firmly, and the pup wagged its tail as though it agreed with her. He stayed for supper that night, and afterward they sat outside where the October stars were hard and bright, and the air had turned to cold velvet. They sat close on the porch step, because it was the natural arrangement when two people were sitting on a porch step together, and August was aware of her proximity with an attention he gave to very little except the land. She was telling him about growing up in Kansas, about her father's ranch, about the way the cattle looked in the morning light when they came to the water tank and stood there steaming in the cold air like living weather. "You loved it," he said, not a question. "I still love it," she said. "I thought I left ranching behind when Thomas died. He was a merchant. We lived in town. But I couldn't stay there and I couldn't stay in Kansas, and when I thought about what I actually wanted, it was always the land." "And now you have it," he said. "Now I have it," she agreed, and she looked at the dark hills with a satisfaction he understood more completely than he had understood almost anything in his life. He was aware of her shoulder near his, and the awareness was not the agitated kind, not the nervous energy of want without direction, but rather a warm, continuous fact, like the heat of a fire that has settled into steady burn. He turned to look at her profile in the dark, the straight line of her nose, the strong chin, the way she held herself even when she was sitting and relaxed. "Louisa," he said. She turned to look at him, and they were close in the dark, close enough that he could see the particular steadiness in her eyes that he had come to rely on without ever formally deciding to. "I'm not a man who says things easily," he said. "I know," she said. "But I've been thinking about you in a way that isn't going to stop, and I think you ought to know it." She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was actually thinking rather than composing a response. Then she said, "August Dunlap, are you telling me you care for me?" "I am," he said, "and I'm doing it badly, which is the truest version of it I have." She reached over and put her hand on his, and her hand was warm and certain, and August, who had not been touched with intention in a great many years, felt it run straight through him. "Then I'll tell you that I've been thinking about you too," she said, "and I'll spare you the badly part because I've been practicing what to say for 3 weeks. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the October dark with the stars enormous overhead and the Wyoming night around them, and it was the simplest and most complete thing August Dunlap had ever been part of. He did not kiss her that night. He was still August Dunlap, still a man who moved with the patience of someone who had built his life one careful thing at a time. But when he rode home in the dark with her hand still warm in the memory of his, he knew that the ranch was no longer the only thing that mattered. It had not been displaced. The land still mattered with every fiber of him, but it had been joined, and he understood now that a life built around only one love was a narrower thing than he had been willing to admit. He rearranged, slowly and without drama, the priorities of his heart. November brought the first real snow, and with the snow came the business of a Wyoming winter, the constant vigilance about the cattle, the frozen water troughs, the careful distribution of hay, the checking of the horses' feet, the management of the bunkhouse where Clem's old bones suffered the cold, and where the Valdez brothers, who had not yet fully adapted to Wyoming winters, burned wood with an enthusiasm that August didn't have the heart to correct. He spent more time at Louisa's cabin than was strictly necessary for neighborliness, and he stopped pretending otherwise. He brought her wood proper amounts, stacked properly, not gestures but necessity. He helped her reinforce the stable that she used for her 2 mules against the heavy snow that came in the second week of November. He checked on her after storms, not because she couldn't manage, but because he wanted to, and she had stopped pretending. She didn't appreciate it in the early November way she sometimes had, with the small resistance of a woman who has learned not to depend on anyone. She let him in now, not just through the door, but past the careful management she kept around herself, and August felt it as the greatest thing she had given him. She came to the ranch regularly through November, and the men accepted her with the straightforward adaptability of people who live and work together, and can see plainly when something is good. Clem treated her with a respect that was distinct from his usual manner, which was not unkind but was economical. Marco brought her biscuits once, proudly, which she ate with genuine appreciation that made Marco stand taller for the rest of the day. Hector, who was the quieter of the brothers, showed her his repairs on the cattle fence and explained his thinking, and she asked good questions. And Hector said afterward to his brother that she was the kind of woman who understood what she was looking at. It was in the middle of November, on a Saturday afternoon when the snow was lying quiet and white over the ranch, and the sky was that particular flat pewter that means more coming, that August kissed her for the first time. They had been in the barn together, looking at a mare who was showing signs of early pregnancy. One of the best horses August owned, a red roan named Calliope, and the conversation had moved from the mare to the spring foaling season to whether Louisa had room in her small stable for an additional animal, and somehow in the middle of the easy back and forth of it, August had become aware that they were standing very close in the dim warmth of the barn, and that Louisa was looking up at him not with the ordinary attention of conversation, but with something that was entirely its own thing. He said her name, just her name, and she said, "August, I swear if you don't," and he did. He kissed her with the careful intensity of a man who had not kissed anyone in a very long time, and who was not about to waste it, and she kissed him back with the uncomplicated warmth of a woman who had decided what she wanted and was not apologizing for it. It was brief and unhurried and entirely real. And when they separated, both of them slightly breathless, Calliope turned to look at them with the mild interest of a horse who has seen stranger things and returned to her hay. "Well," Louisa said after a moment. "Yes," August agreed. She laughed and he smiled, and the barn was warm around them, and outside the snow began to come down again in the silent, serious way that Wyoming snow has, meaning what it says. The winter deepened, and they moved through it together, not yet in the formal sense of the word, but in every practical sense, sharing the labor of keeping their respective operations alive through the cold, sharing meals more often than not, sharing the ordinary conversation of people who have become accustomed to each other's company and have begun to find its absence notable. December brought Christmas, which August had spent alone for the better part of 15 years. He had once made the ride to Cheyenne for Christmas services and the social occasion that followed, and had found it pleasant enough but peripheral, the celebration of other people's fullness that did not quite apply to him. This December he spent Christmas Eve at Louisa's cabin, which she had decorated with a pine bough over the door and candles on the windowsill, and a meal that made August understand what the word abundance meant in a context beyond cattle. Clem and the Valdez brothers ate Christmas dinner at the ranch house, and then August rode the half-mile to Louisa's with a package wrapped in brown paper that contained a pair of riding gloves made from the best leather he could find in Cheyenne, lined with rabbit fur, because her hands should not chap in the winter, and he had been thinking about it for weeks. She opened them with the complete attention she gave everything, and she looked up at him across the table with something in her face that he had to look at for a moment before he understood it. "You were thinking about my hands," she said. "I was," he said. "In November," she said, "when I said my hands were chapping." "Yes." She held the gloves for a moment, and her expression was not the surface gratitude of gifts. It was deeper than that, the recognition of being known by someone who had been paying attention without making a show of it. "August," she said. "You don't need to say anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." She reached across the table the same way she had in October and took his hand and said, "I think you might be the most careful person I have ever known, careful in the way that means something." "You're the first person who's noticed," he said. "I doubt that," she said. "I think you're the first person who's ever made you want to be noticed." That hit him somewhere deep and true, and he held her hand across the table and looked at her in the candlelight and thought, with the clear simplicity of a man who has finally found the right words for something he's been feeling for months, that he was in love with Louisa Langston. He did not say it that night. He was building to it with the same patience he brought to the permanent things. January was a hard month, the kind of Wyoming January that tests what is built and what is only standing. 2 consecutive blizzards dropped 3 feet of snow in the upper pastures and blocked the creek access for the eastern herd. August worked 18-hour days with the men, breaking ice on water troughs, moving hay by sled, checking on animals that had separated from the herd in the storm. On the 3rd day of the second blizzard, Louisa arrived at the ranch in the early morning with her 2 mules loaded with hay from her own modest supply. She said nothing by way of explanation, just began working alongside Hector as though she had always been there, loading and hauling, and August, who was at the far end of the field with Clem when he saw her coming through the snow, stopped and watched her for a moment with his heart very full. He made his way to her through the drifts, and she looked up at him with red cheeks and snowflakes in her hair and said, "I heard you're short on hay." "I am," he said. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she said simply and went back to unloading. Clem, who was standing behind August, said very quietly, "She'll do. which from Clem Purdy was the highest possible evaluation of a person. They worked through the day together, and by the afternoon the worst was managed, not solved, because Wyoming in January has no interest in being solved, but managed, which is all you can ever honestly ask. They brought the animals through, and the losses were minimal, which in a blizzard like that one was almost miraculous, and August knew that Louisa's extra hay had been the margin. That evening, in the ranch house kitchen, while the men ate and the snow continued outside and the stove worked hard to keep the room honest, Louisa sat across the table from August and ate the same beans and salt pork everyone else ate without complaint or ceremony. And August looked at her and understood that she was not just a woman he cared for. She was a partner in the truest sense. Someone who would show up in the blizzard with mule-hauled hay because the operation needed it, and because she had decided they were connected in the way that meant sharing the weight. He said it that night. After supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, and he and Louisa were washing dishes in the kitchen with the efficient ease of people who have been doing things together long enough to know each other's rhythm. "I love you," he said, not dramatically, not constructed, just the truth, stated with the direct simplicity that was the only way he knew how to say the permanent things. She stopped with her hands in the wash basin and looked at him. Her face went through something complicated and then came out on the other side clear. "I love you too," she said. "I've been in love with you since October, when you told me you were doing it badly, and it was the most honest thing I'd heard in years." He set down the dish he was drying and looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the small kitchen and took her face in his hands, his big, calloused, ranch-worn hands, and kissed her properly, with all the patience and intention he had been building toward since June. February was still cold, but it was different. The cold was the same cold, the work was the same work, but there was a warmth running through it that had nothing to do with temperature. August found himself whistling in the barn for the first time in a decade, which Clem pretended not to notice and Marco did not pretend at all. "You're happy," Marco said one morning with the frank amazement of the young. "I am," August said, without defensiveness. Marco grinned and went back to work, and August thought, for a moment, how strange it was that happiness could feel so plain and reasonable when it was real, when it was not the performed version of it or the hoped-for version but the actual thing, arrived at through patient, unglamorous accumulation of genuine feeling. He began to think about the future with a different kind of attention. He had always thought about the ranch's future, the next season, the next decade, what he would build and what he would improve and what the land would hold in the long term. He had planned for the ranch the way a man plans for something he loves, comprehensively, with care, with the assumption of continuity. Now he began to think about the future the way you think about something that holds two people, and that was a different calculation entirely. He did not rush it, but he thought about it. In March, when the snow began its slow Wyoming retreat, and the first mud of spring arrived in the lower pastures, August Dunlap rode into Cheyenne on a clear, cold morning with a purpose that was not feed or fencing, or any of the other ordinary purposes that took him to town. He visited the jeweler on Main Street, a small establishment run by a German immigrant named Werner Braun, who had been making jewelry in Cheyenne since 1875. And he spent an hour in conversation with Werner about what was possible and what was appropriate and what Louisa Langston would and would not want on her hand. He knew her well enough by now to know the difference. She would not want something ornate or difficult. She would want something solid and real that could be worn through a working day without anxiety. Werner showed him several options, and August chose a plain gold band with a single small ruby set flush in the metal, small enough to be practical, significant enough to mean what it was supposed to mean. Werner showed him how it could be paired with a wedding band, and August bought both, and rode back to the ranch with them in his coat pocket, and spent the next 2 weeks carrying them without quite being ready. He was ready on the first Sunday of April, which was Easter Sunday of 1890, and which arrived warm and improbable after the long winter, the air full of the particular sweetness of emerging grass and the creek running high from snowmelt. He rode to Louisa's cabin in the morning, earlier than usual, and she came to the door in her work clothes because she had already been up managing the mules, and she looked at him with the straightforward question of someone who is used to unscheduled visits but can tell when one is different. "You look like you're about to say something large," she said. "I am," he said. She opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." He came in and stood in the middle of her cabin that had become familiar to him as his own, with the yellow curtains and the books on the plank shelf, and the smell of coffee, and the dog Biscuit, who came to him immediately with the confident affection of a creature who has decided he belongs wherever his two favorite people are. August reached into his coat pocket. "Louisa," he said, "I built a ranch on the idea that the land was the only thing worth putting everything into. I spent 20 years being right about that, because I was alone in it and the land never failed me. But you've been here 9 months and I've spent most of them rearranging everything I thought I knew about what matters most, and I'm not interested in going back to the old arrangement." She was very still. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because the ranch needs it, and not because the winters are long, and not because any practical thing requires it. Because I love you and I want the rest of my life to have you in it, and I want to know that when I wake up tomorrow and ride out to check the eastern fence, you're there." He opened his hand and showed her the ring. Louisa Langston looked at the ring in his palm and looked at him, and her eyes were bright, not with tears, though there was something of that, but with the particular brightness of a person who has been waiting for the right thing to arrive and has now recognized it. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, the small ruby catching the spring light. Then she looked up at him. "You know I'm not going to stop having my own opinions about the ranch operations." "I'm counting on it," he said, "and I'm keeping my mules." "They're good mules," he said, "and Biscuit sleeps inside." "Biscuit already sleeps inside," he pointed out, which was true. The dog had been sleeping at the foot of Louisa's bed since November, despite August's initial position that cattle dogs slept in the barn. She laughed, the full warm laugh that he had fallen a little more in love with each time he heard it, and he pulled her to him and held her in the middle of her small cabin, while the April sun came through the yellow curtains, and Biscuit put his paw on August's boot with the proprietary confidence of a dog who knows he is home. They were married in June, 1 year almost exactly from the morning August had stopped his horse on the fence line and touched his hat to a woman in a blue dress studying the mountains. The ceremony took place in Cheyenne, at the small church on the edge of town, and the guests were modest in number but complete in feeling. Clem and the Valdez brothers came in their good clothes, looking scrubbed and earnest. Werner Braun came because he said it mattered to him to see the ring he had made on the right hand. Sheriff Walt Hobbs came because August invited him, and because Hobbs, who was a sentimental man behind the official manner, did not like to miss a wedding. Louisa wore a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Cheyenne, a deep green that suited her coloring and her practicality, because she had told the dressmaker quite firmly that it should be something she could alter afterward into a good Sunday dress, and the dressmaker, who was practical herself, had approved of the approach. She carried wildflowers because the prairie in June was full of them, and she saw no reason to look elsewhere. August wore his best coat, which Clem had brushed to within an inch of its life, and a new hat, and he stood at the altar of that small church and watched Louisa walk toward him down the short aisle, and felt the same thing he had felt in the barn in November, and in the kitchen in January, and on the porch in October. That particular rightness that doesn't announce itself but simply is, the way water runs downhill and good fences hold. She reached him and took his arm, and the minister said the words, and August said his with the directness that was the only way he knew to say anything that mattered, and Louisa said hers with the steadiness that was entirely her own. They were married in the late morning and ate a wedding supper at the hotel in Cheyenne, the only occasion on which August Dunlap had eaten at the hotel, and rode back to the ranch in the long June evening. And when they came through the gate, Marco had hung a string of lanterns from the fence posts on either side of the drive, which cast a soft and festive light all the way to the house, and August looked at it with the expression of a man who did not expect to be moved by lanterns and had been moved anyway. "He did it for you," August told her. "He did it for both of us," she said, and she was right. They moved Louisa's things to the ranch house over the following week. The Heller cabin she decided to keep. They agreed to maintain it as rental property for traveling ranch hands in the busy seasons, which was a sensible use, and brought in a modest supplementary income that Louisa managed with the same clear-eyed efficiency she brought to everything. Her books came to the ranch house and filled the shelf in the sitting room that had held nothing but a lamp since August built it. The yellow curtains she cut down and rehemmed for the kitchen windows, because she liked the color in the morning light and August found he liked it too. Biscuit made the move with complete equanimity, selecting a spot in front of the kitchen stove that he held against all comers, including August, who had stopped trying to relocate the dog somewhere more traditional for cattle dogs around the same time. He had stopped pretending. He was not looking for reasons to ride east. The summer of 1890 was better than the summer before. The drought had broken in late spring with 2 weeks of steady rain, and the grass came back with the grateful energy of a thing that has been waiting, and the cattle were fat and the horses were sound, and the hay would be sufficient for winter without the anxiety of the previous season. August worked the land with the same total commitment he had always given it, but now there was Louisa beside him, not always in the physical sense, because she had her own work, her own mules, her own projects, but beside him in the way that matters, in the sense that the ranch was no longer something he tended alone and returned to alone and defended alone. She had opinions about the herd management that were different from his, coming from a different tradition of ranching, and they disagreed about the best rotation schedule for the northern pasture, with the focused intensity of two people who both take the land seriously. They argued about it one August evening on the porch, with the kind of sharp-edged, honest argument that people who respect each other can have, and resolved it in the end with a compromise that Hector, who had been listening from the barn with the particular diplomacy of a man who knows better than to insert himself, later said was probably better than either of the original positions. "You're a good ranch partner," August told her that night. "I'm a good partner," she said, correcting the scope of the claim, and he leaned over and kissed her temple and said, "Yes, that too." In the late fall of 1890, Louisa told August she was going to have a baby. She told him on a Tuesday evening while he was reading the weekly paper from Cheyenne at the kitchen table, and she set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him, and said it plainly, with the same direct simplicity she applied to everything, and August set down the paper and looked at her. He had not let himself think about children very specifically. He had not allowed himself to construct a future that was too detailed in that direction, because detailed plans had a way of becoming grief, and he had been cautious. But now Louisa was sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the steady look that he had come to love more than almost any other thing in the world, and she had just told him that they were going to have a child, and August Dunlap, who had not cried in more years than he could count, felt something rise in him that was entirely too large for the kitchen but filled it perfectly anyway. "When?" he managed. "June," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. His throat was not cooperating with speech, which was not ideal for a man trying to say something adequate, so he settled for looking at her with all the feeling he had and trusting that she would understand, which she did, because she was Louisa and she always understood what he meant even when the words fell short. "Are you all right?" he asked when he could. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very well, actually. I feel strong." "Good," he said. "That's good." He held her hand and looked at her and thought about the ranch and the spring and the coming year and the child, and all of it seemed to fit together with the organic coherence of things that are supposed to be. And he thought that 20 years ago he had started building this place without the remotest idea of what it would eventually hold. The winter of 1890 and into 1891 was the gentler kind, which Wyoming occasionally permitted as though in apology for its more difficult expressions. The snow was manageable, the temperatures were cold but not brutal, and the ranch went through the season with the smooth efficiency of an operation that has been well prepared. Clem spent more of the winter in the ranch house than the bunkhouse, by incremental degrees that nobody formally acknowledged, and the kitchen became the kind of kitchen that is busy in the morning with coffee and the business of the day. Louisa continued working through the winter with the practical stubbornness of a woman who knows her own body, and August learned not to treat her as though she were fragile. She had made her position on that clear and early, while still doing the things that showed her he was paying attention. He moved the heavier hauling to himself, and the hands without comment. He made sure the firewood was always plentiful without requiring her to ask. He stayed close to home in the last weeks, which the men managed smoothly because Hector had, by this point, a thorough understanding of the ranch that required less direction from August than it once had. The baby was born in early June of 1891, on a warm morning when the grass was long and the horses were in the pasture, and the ranch was at its most beautiful, which August had always thought was saying something, because it was beautiful in all its seasons. The baby was a boy, 8 pounds, and loud about it from the first moment, and Louisa held him with the expression of a woman who has done something she is deeply satisfied by and is not inclined to understate it. They named him James August Dunlap, for the simple reason that they both liked the name James, and it was solid in the way that names should be. August held his son for the first time standing in the bedroom he and Louisa shared, at the window that looked out over the yard and the pasture and the mountains beyond, and he felt the particular vertigo of a man who has just understood that the thing he loved most has once again expanded, not replaced, not competed with, but expanded, the way a good ranch grows without betraying what it was. "He looks like you," Louisa said from the bed, her voice tired and content in equal measure. "His nose, maybe," August said. "His determination," she corrected, and August laughed, and the baby, startled by the sound, made a small, indignant noise that made both of them laugh again. Clem came to see the baby that afternoon with his hat in his hands and his best expression of formal dignity, and he held James for approximately 30 seconds before the baby grabbed his thumb with a grip that Clem evaluated seriously. "He'll be useful," Clem pronounced, and handed him back, and that was Clem's entirety on the subject, which was exactly right. Hector and Marco came the following morning and stood at the door in a way that suggested they were uncertain of the protocols, and Louisa called them in and showed them the baby with the warmth of a woman who has decided that this house is exactly as large as it needs to be to hold everyone who matters. And Marco held James and spoke to him quietly in Spanish with the natural ease of a young man who has younger siblings. And James looked at him with the comprehensive focus of a newborn encountering the world, and Louisa watched from the bed and thought that this ranch, which had once belonged entirely to a man who had believed it was better to love things that could not leave, had become something that contained all the fullest kinds of love there are. August ran the ranch through the summer of 1891, with James on his back, in a carrier contraption that Louisa had ordered from a catalog, and that August had initially regarded with deep skepticism. He had come around to it entirely by the 3rd week, when it became clear that James was content there in a way he was not otherwise, and that riding out to check the fence with a small, warm weight on his back was, in fact, not an impractical arrangement but a very fine one. He brought James to see the cattle from the fence rail when the boy was 3 months old, holding him up with both hands so he could look at the longhorns in the morning light, and James looked at them with the solemn concentration of an extremely young person making assessments. "That's yours too," August told him. "All of it." The cattle grazed. The mountain stood. The creek ran. James made a sound of opinion that was impossible to interpret and entirely satisfying. Life on the Dunlap ranch found its new shape over the following years, with the organic rightness of things that have been built on honest foundations. Clem officially moved his bunk into the small room off the kitchen in the winter of 1892, which everyone treated as entirely natural. Hector took over more of the daily management with a steadiness that confirmed everything August had known about him from the start. Marco, who had been saving money since he arrived, bought a small plot 10 miles east in 1893 and started his own operation with August's help, and a handshake that meant everything it needed to mean. And he remained close enough that the connection between the ranches was a practical and personal benefit to both. Louisa kept the Heller cabin in use for seasonal workers and managed the accounts for the ranch with a clarity that revealed several inefficiencies August had been too close to see, and corrected them without ceremony. She also kept her mules, which were excellent mules who lived good long lives and were never questioned about their housing arrangements. They had a second child, a daughter named Ruth, in the spring of 1893, and Ruth arrived with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and the particular confidence of a child who is welcomed without ambivalence, which she was, entirely. James, who was 2 when Ruth arrived, accepted her with the somewhat patronizing interest of a small boy who has been prepared by patient parents for an addition to the household. And by the time Ruth could walk, they were inseparable in the way of ranch children who have each other and an enormous amount of space. And August would sometimes stand at the kitchen window in the evening and watch them in the yard in the last light, chasing Biscuit or chasing each other, and feel something for which he did not have adequate language, which was fine because he had always communicated better in action anyway. In the fall of 1894, August and Louisa rode out to the eastern fence line together on a morning that was clear and cold, the grass gone gold and the mountains blue against the sky, and they stopped where August had stopped his horse on that Tuesday morning 5 years before, the morning he had seen a woman in a blue dress studying the mountains as if she were deciding whether to trust them. "Right here," August said. Louisa looked at him. "I know," she said. "I saw you coming from 50 yards." He looked at her. "You did." "I heard the horse," she said, with the mild dignity of a woman who has never pretended not to notice things. "I was deciding whether to look up." "What made you look up?" "You stopped," she said. "People who mean nothing keep moving." August turned that over for a moment, looking at the mountains and the fence line and the pasture beyond, at the country that had been his whole life for so long and was now something larger than it had been. "I didn't know what I was stopping for," he said honestly. "That's all right," she said. "I knew enough for both of us." He reached over and took her hand, right there on horseback on the eastern fence line in the October morning, and she held it with the same warmth and certainty she had brought to everything since the beginning. The ranch ran on around them, the cattle in the lower pasture, the horses in the paddock, the children in the yard with Clem watching from the porch, with the careful patience of an old man who has found the closest thing to family the last chapter of his life was going to offer him. The creek ran from Louisa's spring across the eastern corner. Through the fence August had moved 40 yards to reach it, feeding the land that fed everything. August Dunlap had loved his ranch more than any living thing for 20 years, had given it his mornings and his winters and his total commitment, and his best thinking and the deepest part of his capacity for devotion. And he still loved it. He loved it every morning when he rode out and the land answered him, and every evening when he came back and the buildings stood where he had built them, solid and reliable, asking nothing but care. But he had found, in the space of one summer and one autumn and one winter, that the love he had always thought was the largest thing in him had turned out to be preparation. Not lesser for what came after, bigger, holding more, expanded by Louisa in the way that good things expand when they are joined by something true. He had been building a home for 20 years, without knowing he was building it for her. He thought that, standing at the eastern fence in the October light with her hand in his, and he thought it was perhaps the truest thing he had ever understood about his own life. And he held her hand and looked at the mountains, and the mountains were the same mountains they had always been, permanent and enormous, and exactly where they were supposed to be, and so was everything else. The winter of 1895 brought the third pregnancy, which Louisa announced to August in the kitchen on a January morning with the calm confidence of a woman who is no longer surprised by what her life has become because she has decided to welcome all of it. This one, she said, felt different from the first two, which proved accurate. Their third child arrived in September, another boy, and they named him Thomas, for Louisa's first husband, because August was a man who understood that the dead do not threaten the living, and because Louisa had loved someone before him and that love had shaped her into the woman he had fallen for, and it deserved to be honored. Young Thomas was smaller than James had been and loud in a completely different register, and he slept badly for the first months and woke the household with an impartiality that did not discriminate between parents or the old ranch hand in the side room or the cattle dog who had claimed the kitchen floor. But he grew fast and strong, and by spring was the kind of baby who grins at everyone with equal and abundant goodwill. And Ruth, who was 2 and accustomed to being the younger one, took to her new position as middle child with a pragmatic flexibility that Louisa recognized as deeply familiar. Clem Purdy died in the February of 1897 in the small room off the kitchen, at the age of 73, after a life that had been long and physical and mostly good. He died in the early morning without drama and without pain, according to the doctor who came out from Cheyenne, which was, everyone agreed, the right way for Clem to have done it. August sat beside him in the afternoon after the doctor left, and was quiet for a long time, feeling the kind of grief that is proportional and appropriate and does not try to be more than it is, because the man had lived a full life and had known, in his last years, the warmth of a household that cared about him. Louisa found August there and sat beside him without speaking, and that was the right thing to do, and she knew it. And they sat together in the quiet of the room until the evening came, and then she made supper and they called the children in, and life went on the way it does and should after a good death continuing, with room in it for the grief, and full enough that the grief is not the whole of it. Hector Valdez ran the ranch hands now with an authority that was calm and complete, and the Dunlap ranch was known in the county as one of the well-run operations. Not the largest, not the flashiest, but consistent and fair. A place where men wanted to work because the conditions were honest, and the owners treated their hands as people rather than inventory. That reputation was partly Auguste's and partly Louisa's. She had instituted Sunday dinners at the ranch house for the full operation, workers and family together, in the fall of 1892, and the practice had stuck and spread, and was by now simply the way things were done on the Dunlap ranch. The children grew up on the land the way children should grow up on land, knowing it thoroughly, with the particular intelligence that comes from a childhood spent understanding that things have consequences, that animals have needs, that weather is real, that work done well matters and work done badly costs everyone. James was a serious child who understood the cattle before he was 10 with the instinctive connection of someone born to it. Ruth had opinions about horses that were both extensive and correct, and she could ride by the time she was 4 with the born ease of a girl who had come into the world knowing what she was for. Thomas was the social one, sunny and curious and interested in everyone he met, with his mother's warmth and his father's attention to what was actually true. August watched them and thought, on the mornings when he rose before the sun and stood on the porch in the cold air and looked out at the land, that he had spent 20 years building something and had not known what he was building it for, that the ranch had always been a place that could hold more than one man's love, that the land had been patient with him, The way it was patient with everything, letting him believe for as long as he needed to that it was only his. And then welcoming Louisa and the children and Clem and the Valdez brothers and the dog and the mules, with the same enormous unassuming capacity that it welcomed the rain and the snow, and the particular quality of light that came across the Wyoming high country in the late afternoon, and made everything it touched look like it had been here forever, and was not going anywhere. He and Louisa sat on the porch in the summer evenings when the work was done, and they talked about what they were building and what they would leave behind, and sometimes they sat without talking, which was also its own kind of communication. The comfortable silence of two people who have learned each other thoroughly enough that presence does not require performance. She had been right about the northern pasture rotation. He had been right about the well placement in the lower field. They were both right about the children and the Sunday dinners and the dog sleeping in the kitchen, and about the fact that the land was better for being shared. In the summer of 1899, on a warm evening with the kind of sky that Wyoming puts on in June when it wants to remind you exactly where you are and why it matters, August and Louisa sat on the ranch house porch and watched James, who was 8 years old and entirely competent on horseback, ride the fence line on a small roan gelding that had been his for 2 seasons. Ruth sat at the porch step with a book and Biscuit II, the son of the original Biscuit, who had inherited his father's place at the kitchen stove and his father's opinion that August's boot was an appropriate armrest. Thomas was somewhere in the barn with Hector, learning things about harnesses. The mountain stood blue and reliable in the evening distance. The creek ran in the lower field, still fed by Louisa's spring. The cattle were in the south pasture, comfortable and fat on good summer grass. August looked at all of it, at the land he had built and the life he had built in it, and then he looked at Louisa beside him, and she turned and looked at him at the same moment, with those steady brown eyes that had been the first thing about her he could not argue his way around. 20 years I had this place to myself, he said, and I thought I had everything. You had a lot, she said fairly. I did, he agreed, but I had it wrong. She tilted her head at him, waiting. I thought it was enough to love something that couldn't leave, he said. The land doesn't go anywhere. The cattle, you manage them. The buildings, you maintain them. Nothing leaves if you hold on to it right. I thought that was how you keep from losing things. And now, she said, now I think the things worth keeping are the ones that could leave and don't, he said. You could have left, any time. When Beckett came after your land, when the first winter was hard, when I was slower at saying things than I should have been. You could have gone back to Kansas and had an easier time of it. I could have, she said, but you stayed. I stayed, she said, because this is where I was supposed to be, because you were here and the land was here and I wanted both of them. He reached over and took her hand, on the porch in the June evening, the same way he had on horseback at the eastern fence 5 years before and across the kitchen table before that. And Louisa held his hand the same way she always had, without drama, without performance, with the full and simple warmth of a woman who knows exactly what she is holding and has chosen it freely. James came in from the fence line and put the roan in the paddock with the experienced ease of a child who has been taught right, and came up to the porch with a red face and the report that the eastern section of the fence was holding fine. Good, August said. Can I have the black horse next year? James asked, with the negotiating directness of a child who has watched his parents handle things and learned that the direct approach is the honest one. Ask me again in the spring, August said. He'll be old enough, Louisa said, and gave August a look that was both warm and entirely decisive, and August recognized the look of a woman who has already made up her mind and is allowing the formality of the question to run its course. In the spring, August said, and James, who was his father's son in enough ways to understand what that meant, said yes, sir, and went inside satisfied. Ruth looked up from her book with the mild observation of a girl who has been listening to everything while appearing to read. He's going to name it something terrible, she said. He is, Louisa agreed. August shook his head, but he was smiling, and the evening was going gold, and the mountains were the mountains, and Louisa's hand was warm in his, and the ranch ran, and the family held, and the life he had spent 20 years building alone was now the fullest thing he had ever known. That was the thing about honest love, August thought, watching the evening settle over his land. It did not take anything away. It did not diminish the thing you had built or demand that you be less than you were. It arrived and said, simply, that there was room for more, and if you were brave enough or patient enough or fortunate enough to let it in, everything you had built became the foundation of something larger than you had known how to imagine alone. He had loved his ranch more than any living thing for 20 years. And then Louisa Langston had moved in, and he had found himself, with the willing surprise of a man who thought he knew all the territory of his own heart, rearranging the priorities, not because the land mattered less, but because he had learned at last that the land and the love were not competitors. They were the same impulse, the same devotion, the same insistence on building something real and tending it and being present to it in every season, through every drought and blizzard and difficulty, because that is what you do with the things that are yours. The summer evening deepened toward dusk. Thomas came out of the barn with a smear of grease on his cheek and the look of a boy who has learned something and is pleased about it. Ruth put her book down and stretched. Biscuit the second came to the door and sat there with the expectant attention of a cattle dog who knows supper is not far off. Louisa rose to go inside, and she paused in the doorway and looked back at August, and the look she gave him was the look he had been carrying in his chest since October of 1889, the look that said, simply and completely, that she was here, and she was his, and this was the life she had chosen with the full use of her considerable intelligence and the whole of her free will, and she would not be choosing differently. "Come inside, August," she said. He stood up from the porch chair, the chair he had sat in alone for so many evenings before she came, and he went inside. The door closed behind them. The ranch stood in the summer dusk, the grass long in the far pasture, the mountains dark against a sky full of the first stars, the creek running in the lower field from the spring that Louisa had found and given freely because the cattle needed water, and those were not complicated calculations. It was a good ranch. It had always been a good ranch. But it was better now, in the way that everything is better when it is shared with someone who understands what it cost and loves it for that reason, not in spite of the hardness of it, but because the hardness is part of what makes it real. And real things, August Dunlap had learned, at the age of 42, on a fence line on a Tuesday morning in June, are worth stopping for.